This morning on the Ag Issues program, pleasure as always to bring on to the program Roger McEowen, professor of agricultural law and taxation at the Washburn University School of Law, as he joins us on the program this morning. Roger, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Greg. Doing just fine.
Well, normally this time of year, we dive into a top 10 list for 2024, but there is also the not quite top 10 list because, to say the least, Roger, there are many developments that take place, and trying to sort that out into a top 10, and those who quite didn't make the top 10, I'm sure are fun to do.
Yeah, that's true. I started out, and it happened again this year, but I start out going through what I think are the big developments, and I'm usually got 30 or 40. And, of course, the list says 10, so I got to pare it down to 10. And then I decide, well, some of these are important enough, still need to talk about and write about because they're going to have implications going forward. But there were still 10 more that were more important. So that's how I get the top 10. And what I'm looking for, Greg, is impact on the agricultural sector as a whole. So a lot of these are not going to be state-specific developments. They're going to be developments at the federal level or the U.S. Supreme Court or federal regulations that impact the sector as a whole. So that's how I winnow things down.
Well, let's get to it as we go. First off, looking at the not quite top 10 list, and that starts with USDA's push for climate smart agriculture.
Yeah, and this push may have hit a dead end now, but this was a big issue in 2024 when the USDA is really trying to manipulate producers' behavior by providing taxpayer funding for what they would call CSAs, or climate smart agricultural practices. And USDA put about $3 billion tax dollars into getting farmers to enroll in projects such as those designed to reduce methane emissions or sequester carbon. And I know that's already gotten the attention of Elon Musk and the Department of Governmental Efficiency, and they put a freeze on these, of course, on all types of federal spending so that they can examine exactly the use of those funds. And frankly, that is a great idea. I know that causes a lot of consternation right now, but at some point in time, you have to do that. If you're going to get the budget under control, you've got to come in with a microscope and look at things. And I've never seen this happen in our lifetimes. You go back to the Reagan years, and of course, revenues went way up, but the problem has always been on the spending side. And that's the same thing with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act under Trump. Revenues to the federal government have increased substantially under TCJA. That is often misreported, but revenues are high, and it's primarily on the corporate tax side of things, just looking at the IRS data. That revenue is way up, and it's exceeded projections. However, the deficit problem continues because of the spending on Congress. So if Congress isn't going to control the spending, then you've got to come in with the executive branch cutting what they have discretion to do. So that's what's happening here. So it's very important that somebody who can step really outside of politics and examine all of this stuff and all the dead weight that's in there. And that's why you see the government encouraging government workers to take early retirement, to remove some of the top end of this. So it'll be painful to go through, but I think absolutely necessary from a fiscal standpoint. So you've got $3 billion that have been poured into this, and it's termed the USDA's Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities projects, and it flows really from the Securities and Exchange Commission's plans that were announced back in 2022 to force all publicly traded companies to submit an ESG report. Those are the environmental, social governance reports. And then 5 months later, the USDA's project was announced. So it's not just farmers that are on the take here. As of mid-2024, and this is really what has caught DOJ's attention, $90 million had been paid to ADM, $95 million went to the Iowa Soybean Association, and $40 million to the Farm Journal. And 27 universities got various amounts each in the millions of dollars. So, that, and of course, just a few days ago, the government, Trump ordered USDA to remove all references to climate smart and agriculture and climate change more specifically from its website. So this is something that might be changing as the government looks pretty closely at how efficiently things are being run.
A term that I'm sure many producers have heard about, but is also one that's also on the not quite top 10 list, PFAS, and that, of course, is in the chemical realm, but how they affect rural landowners.
Yeah, PFAS are widely used long-lasting chemicals that have components that break down slowly over time. Now, they've been used since the 1940s, and they're in water and air and soil all over the globe, not just in the United States, but everywhere. And they're used for many commercial and industrial products. Now, some studies have shown that the PFAS may be linked to harmful health effects in humans and animals. And they're actually a group, Greg, of more than 15,000 chemicals that are associated with various cancers and other health problems. Now, the issue that we have, well, a couple issues, and it's important for agriculture, and there have been some legal developments on this, significant ones in 2024. There's no known method for cleaning up PFAS contamination. And so I think the biggest potential problem for agriculture involving PFAS will likely be biosolids. That's the solid matter that remains at the end of a wastewater treatment process, and they often are land applied, and farmers find benefits in doing that. It recycles nutrients and fertilizers and creates cost savings on chemicals and fertilizers, and there has been more use of biosolids in recent years as fertilizer prices went up. So you do get recycling of nutrients and fertilizers, and that's a good thing. But the uptake of the PFAS by plants will vary depending on the PFAS concentration in the soil and the water and the type of soil and how much it rains or how much irrigation you use, the type of plant. Well, here's the rub. The federal government, the EPA, treats PFAS as a hazardous substance under federal law. That's under Superfund law. And it can be a major concern for rural landowners. And if you go back a few years, in 2019, PFAS were discovered on farms in Maine and New Mexico, and that resulted in the disposal of most of the livestock on those farms. Then you go forward 3 years. In 2022, there was a Michigan 400-acre cattle farm, which was a century farm, been in the family for over 100 years, and they had to shut down because the state of Michigan was testing for the presence of PFAS in soil. And they found high levels of PFAS in the beef products from their cattle and the soil at that farm. And now what had happened was the farm had received those biosolids from a municipal wastewater treatment plant, and they were using them to fertilize crops, which were later harvested and fed to the cattle. And so it ends up in the soil, ends up in the cattle. Now he can't sell his cattle, he can't farm, he can't grow crops, and they lost the farm. Now in 23, that farm sued an auto parts supplier in the locality for releasing those PFAS into the wastewater system that they're claiming, the farmers claiming, contaminated the biosolids. So they're seeking tens of millions of dollars in punitive damages to help them cover the cost of remediating the farm's soil and groundwater. They have to replace the soil. Can you imagine what a mess this is? Well, I think what's going to be a trend here is that more states are going to start testing for this. Kansas does not currently test for PFAS in wastewater, and sampling has occurred of a select number of mechanical wastewater plants for PFAS in the plant's effluent since 2022, but KDHE has not sampled biosolids from those facilities. If they start doing that, we could run into some serious problems here. And then last year, the development, why this is on the list in 24, several Texas farmers sued a major biosolid provider for manufacturing and distributing contaminated biosolid-based fertilizer that was put on their farm fields, which resulted in damage to the farms and health problems. And that's an ongoing case. That's huge. So we'll see what happens on this. I think this is a big issue. It was certainly a huge issue in 2024, not quite the top 10, but a big one nevertheless. And we'll see what states do to react to this moving forward. But, Greg, that's going to be a big issue.
Roger McEowen, Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation at the Washburn University School of Law, is joining us, and we are looking at some of the not quite top tens for ag law and tax issues in 2024. Roger, one of the big ones, or one for the cattle industry at least, was the EID mandate for the cattle industry.
Yeah, that's right, Greg. And this went into effect, fully into effect in November of 24, but the rules came out in the spring of 24 before they were finalized. But this goes back quite a number of years. It's got a long history to it and kind of a tortured and twisted history to it. And it goes back to the U.S. Entering the WTO at its formation in 1995. And of course, the express purpose of the WTO was to increase imports and exports around the world. So when the WTO was formed, there were recommendations that were made for nations to adopt animal ID procedures to track disease in animals as a means to facilitate trade. That's how it was couched. And in the U.S., efforts concerning animal ID began in 1999, started accelerating in 2002. Then, of course, in 2002, you had the Canadian cow that was infected with BSE that entered the United States, and that created a greater interest in all of this. So Congress also, they came up with the NAIS, and that's the National Animal Identification System that was proposed by APHIS in 2002, and that led to voluntary premises identification. So you'll see a pattern here. This typically happens with government intervention. Something starts out voluntary, and then it morphs into being mandatory with fines and penalties and so forth, and that's what's happened with EID. But it was voluntary, and to use electronic identification devices, the EID ear tags on all classes of cattle. Well, there was a great deal of participation in this. 80% of hog farms voluntarily complied. 95% of poultry operations, but it's very, very unpopular with cattle producers across the country. There's only about 18% of cattle operations that voluntarily participated. So Congress stopped the funding of the program, and there was a 2010 fact sheet that put out. And the USDA acknowledged that, the vast majority of people, participants, were highly critical of the NAIS program. And so USDA then promised in 2010 that they would take a new approach, give you more flexibility, lower cost, and make it less burdensome. Well, not so much. We had a 2010 development. We had a 2013 final rule. We had a 2024. That then was out there for quite some time, and again, USDA promising flexibility to cattle producers, and but the USDA made it clear that it would not end APHIS's quest to expand the animal ID mandate. And there was a fact sheet that was put out in the spring of 2019. There was a notice talking about radio frequency ID. That was going to be the only option going forward. So there goes your freedom here, your freedom of choice. And like we said, they're morphing into something mandatory. And then they came out on May 9 of 2024 with a new final rule completely eliminating flexibility and lower cost options and less burdensome requirements that were promised in the 2013 final rule. So that became effective November 5 last year. And so there are a whole bunch of rules. If you're shipping adult cattle and bison interstate, they have to bear an EID tag. Although you could have a device pursuant to the 2013 rule that you could retain. So it effectively eliminated a lot of flexibility that were given to producers under the 2013 final rule to use those lower cost ear tags that don't require premises registration. We don't have time to get into the details of the rule. I've posted on this and written on this, but APHIS has acknowledged a bunch of shortcomings with respect to this, and only one of those was addressed in the 2024 rule. But there are legal challenges to it that will continue to work its way through the court system in 2025. And of course, concern to cattle producers is if you have traceability, you could face legal liability if that disease can be traced back to a particular farm or producer. And that raises a bunch of legal questions too. So I understand the need to trace disease and eliminate it. But cattle producers largely have trouble with the rule. And we'll see. This most recent battle involving exports and tariffs with Canada and Mexico, that's going to play into this a little bit. The more products that we raise in the United States, if it's an animal from birth all the way to slaughter, the safer the food system will be. So we'll see. We'll see what happens with respect to that. But that also I had on my not quite top 10 list for 2024.
Well, Roger, before we end the program, we'll give them a little bit of a tease as far as the top 10 list is concerned. We can talk about number 10, and obviously we'll get into the rest next week. And on your top 10, at number 10, was the state's water compact must include the federal government, but this has to do with the Rio Grande Compact of 1938.
Yeah, but most of the time, Greg, states can enter into water compacts amongst themselves. They don't have to involve the Congress. But the Constitution says, it's Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3, says no state shall, without the consent of Congress, enter into any agreement or compact with another state. So what that has been construed to mean over time is when the federal government has an interest in a water agreement among states, it has to be a party to the agreement. And that's exactly what happened in this compact between Colorado, New Mexico, and Texas involving the Rio Grande Compact in 1938, which Congress approved in 1939. That is apportioning water amongst those states, and there's also a treaty with Mexico that's involved in this. So those states, when they're deciding how to allocate water amongst them, have to involve the federal government. They have to go through Congress. And that's what the Supreme Court said in 2018. The states proceeded to ignore that. And the Supreme Court came back in 2024 and said, look, we told you in 2018 that you've got to consider the government's interests here. The Congress has to approve that compact. Your settlement was inconsistent with the original compact, and it undermined the compact's plain language. And you can't do that without congressional approval. And that's so what the court did in 2024, sent it back to a special master on the basis that the Constitution controlled this and the government's interest has to be protected.
All right, Roger, we're going to put a cap on it there. But obviously, if people want more information, want to read more on your not quite top 10 list and your top 10 list, do you have that posted already?
Not yet. I'm cleaning up some typos. I'll get it posted later today and then send it over to K-State so it can go up on Ag Manager.
All right, sounds good. Well, looking forward to in 2 weeks when we talk about that, and we appreciate it. As always, thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg.
That is Roger McEowen, Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation at the Washburn University School of Law, as he joins us this morning on the Ag Issues program here on 580 WIBW.